a lot of organizations think of the brand as an asset. They think of it as something that you put money into or you don't put money into, you invest in or you don't invest in. And nothing makes me cringe more when I hear people say, well, we need to do more brand advertising and less performance. I'm like, by the way, everything you do is your brand. Whether you call it brand advertising or performance, it is brand. And I think that the world that's out there, consumers, they don't see the difference. If all you're doing is performance advertising, that's how they see your brand. They see it as a transactional brand. They see it as a very pragmatic brand. And guess what? For some, that might work in the short term, but it's not going to work in the long term. Just ask Airbnb. They totally flipped their model and it basically saved their business. They had turned into a performance marketing company and almost killed them.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the eMarketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
I'm super pleased to be here with Tim Gallus today. Tim is the Chief Idea Officer at Barkley. And so I wanted to start off with a question that relates specifically to an unusual title. So should every organization have their own Chief Idea Officer, or is it uniquely something that agencies should consider doing? And how did you end up with the title?
It's a great question. Yeah, it is a different title. So I always tell people, especially on Monday mornings, that I use Monday mornings to redefine my title every week because I can apply it to so many different things. I kind of like the title for agencies and creative organizations. I like it for any type of organizations. Not necessarily just for the title, but the idea that you have someone that might be, in other words, the chief generalist at your organization. So sometimes I think that's my title, is the chief generalist, and part of my role is to integrate current offerings. So for us, that's strategy and transformation and communications and activation, but also design and experience. So I kind of sit in the middle of what I call our 3 idea centers. But also it's to look for the next opportunity. So it's a very proactive role. But I do like that idea of having a chief generalist. Sometimes, that can be a visionary CEO, that can be a chief brand officer if they apply it right. But yes, I highly recommend it if you can get up on Mondays and make sure you can define the title.
Yeah, I don't use it as my title in any of the organizations, but I guess the common theme across the various hats that I wear is marketing mad scientist, right? Which is this idea that I'm constantly figuring out how to glue technology together to solve marketing problems, because I come at marketing from a pretty geeky perspective. So I guess that's my flavor of the Chief Idea Officer. So, obviously, when you're talking about the Chief Idea Officer, there are big ideas and small ideas and medium-sized ideas. So when I sort of initially thought about your title, I thought like, oh, he's the big idea guy. But the reality is that there's probably also sometimes material, small and medium-sized ideas. So is the Chief Idea Officer mostly a big idea person, or is it sometimes smaller ideas too?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in kind of those 2 realms of, integrating what we currently have and looking towards what's next, all of that takes the small, medium, large, and sometimes extra large ideas. On the small side, I think it's important, and I hate to say this, but over the years, a big part of my role has been process, which, that dreaded P word, but process and having a point of view and figuring out how to pull it off in an organization is really important. A lot of times I talk to other people that are working inside of brands and organizations, and they refer to it as the lingua franca, or the common language. And sometimes having that common language that everybody can use is really important. So a lot of what I do that might necessarily not be as sexy as other things is really in the form of pulling things together and making sure everybody is working towards the same goal. And that common language can't be, the importance of it can't be understated. So yeah, there's a lot of small ideas that tend to come under the banner of process. And then sometimes it's just a little bit of a nudge and a little bit of a inspiration here and there. But hopefully they add up to something bigger. And then sometimes it is that big idea that you just sort of, what we call a moonshot, and you just kind of bring it in and see how you can make it happen. I'm really a big fan of working backwards, imagining the future and then figuring out how to get there. I'm not a very linear person. So you might never hear me say that word process, at least for this interview again.
Well, yeah, I guess the more non-linear you are, the more you need process to, actually get something accomplished.
Yeah, if you can balance the two, that's sort of, I feel like that's my world is how do you stay on the tracks and go super fast, but not veer off and go over a cliff. So yeah, a little bit of process helps.
I noticed you've done both speaking engagements and also written a lot about purpose and brand purpose. And I get the sense from a lot of brands that they sort of, when they're in search of purpose, they just want to glue purpose onto an existing brand, and that it sort of comes off as inauthentic. So for brands who are trying to both define and live their purpose that really resonates with consumers, how do you recommend they start going through the process of sort of rethinking the brand from a purpose-centric perspective?
It's interesting because we work with brands on purpose, but I am really reticent to say that we are in the purpose business because I feel that there's usually something inside of an organization, inside their culture and their DNA that just needs to be drawn out. And I really don't like the idea of bringing purpose to an organization. I love the idea of helping them find it. I guess one of the first things that we look at is, to your point about just slapping it on top of a brand, it's not a marketing idea. And I think that, unfortunately, that's where purpose has a lot of tension right now, because a lot of people see it as a marketing idea and a silver bullet. And it can be a silver bullet, but I don't think it's a marketing idea. For us, we really see it as a strategic idea and an everything idea. So I say start with the culture, look at what's there, look at that origin story, look at what's special about the organization, and then try to get there from that. In lieu of that, because it happens where, some organizations say, there is absolutely nothing special about us. I don't think that's true, but I think in lieu of that, I've seen some really interesting brands start to look at the opportunity they have by the license that they have for purpose. And sometimes that license is creating something that didn't exist before, but it's based on their culture and based on their DNA, not based on a marketing opportunity.
Interesting. When companies go through ownership changes, I would imagine that in some cases that DNA changes radically. Sometimes all of a sudden, right? And so purpose may therefore change suddenly and pivot pretty dramatically. I would guess right now the one that comes to mind would be, Twitter is in the process of potentially going through a purpose transformation. Maybe not a full 180 degrees, but a pretty significant one. So how in that particular instance, what would your advice be to Elon and team as they sort of redefine their purpose?
Well, that's a tough one because every day it changes. I've thought a lot about it because what he's done with other businesses, is so remarkable. But Twitter is very different, and what's happening right now is really, really interesting. But I look at Twitter, and what I would do is really look at what is unique about Twitter, what is true about it, why is it still around, to be honest? Because it's been one of the large platforms. It really has never made money, but it has had an outsized impact on the world. And I would start with that. What is it really good for? Why do people really love it? And one thing I might do with Twitter is I would look, instead of the internal culture, I might look at that culture of the Twitter diehards that have really stuck with it through thick and thin. And I might start there as my recommendation to Elon Musk, and say, look at that culture that has been with you through thick and thin, because much of that could have gone away. Very different than some of the other big social media platforms. But that's where I would start. I would start doing really full-blown stakeholder interviews with the diehards versus the internal culture, and also the internal culture. But who has stayed despite all the the lines drawn in the sand and the ultimatums? Who's still there? That's pretty interesting. Who has stuck it out that didn't, could have gone and gotten another job? I think that's also a really interesting study at Twitter. There's probably a documentary happening on that right this second.
Right. Yeah, that you make a really valid point about it's not necessarily just the internal stakeholders, but external stakeholders that to some extent define purpose for a brand. And it brings to mind this idea that sometimes a brand goes through a little bit of a transformation or gets repurposed by a new category that wasn't on the initial sort of strategic and creative brief, right? And I can think of some brands, fashion brands in particular, that to some extent the brand was co-opted by a particular persona or a particular group, a demographic, where if you went back to the original, brand owner internally and you said, oh yeah, these clothes are now being worn heavily by so-and-so, or these shoes are heavily being bought by so-and-so. And, does that change the purpose? Does that change the brand? And how should the brand handle that, right? Because, whether it's a particular car or a particular fashion brand, it developed a life of its own, right? And so how would you handle that as a brand owner or as a CMO of a company where that has happened?
Yeah, I think, a lot of brands, you sort of said it, this idea of brand ownership. I think that's sort of the first paradigm that especially for us, when we think of brands, that's really the first thing that has to shift. I think for most of what we call brand marketing's history, marketers feel like they own the brand, and in reality it's the people on the outside, it's customers, I mean really all of those stakeholders. It's their perception of what the brand is. And one you might be referring to or thinking about in that history is a brand like Adidas that's has a long history that goes back to the 1940s and through the 50s, and really the golden age of the Olympics era, but then really got discovered in a very different way by streetwear, hip hop, etc. And then obviously the challenges and growth that they've had in recent years has really been a really hot topic. I think, first of all, you're lucky if your brand gets any sort of cultural growth, like a brand like Adidas, lots of fashion brands. And I think you have to look at what is happening. Is there something key to your purpose or key to your DNA that is making that happen? And you have to let it happen in sort of a masterful way. But what I think is great about Adidas and smart about a brand like that, they realize that they have a heritage side and what they call the original side, but then they have sort of this forward-facing technology side and this cultural side. And they've figured out how to balance both. And I think that just being true to that balance is really how brands are navigating that. So they're not saying no to the growth, but they're using it as innovation for the future. And I love that. And I think we can learn a lot from fashion brands that way, and brands that take off culturally. But I think it's finding that balance and not saying, oh, that's not us, and kind of putting up a roadblock to interesting growth and interesting audiences, but understanding how do I kind of balance that? And I think that that's the trick. And you can see really, interesting fashion brands from Polo to Tommy Hilfiger have had the same interesting battles, but they're very glad to have a cultural halo that helps them sell basic wear at Macy's. That's the way I always think about it. Same with a brand like Patagonia. Most of Patagonia is sold to people that use it to go buy a Starbucks, but they've got this halo of what the dirt bags is what Yvon Chouinard calls them. And they're fine to have both. And it's been sort of a masterful blend of, high culture and real basic needs.
Yeah, I was thinking about Tommy Hilfiger when I asked the question as well. And I haven't really been following the brand closely enough to know whether or not they're on the waning side of that now. Have they been able to maintain the momentum within those additional audiences that sort of took their brand and ran with it, or have they sort of become more passé within that group at this point?
Yeah, I think they're definitely waning, but it's interesting. Brands like Timberland, Polo, they've kind of always gone up and down as far as their cultural references. And you just never know, though. I think you and I have talked about a brand like Crocs. You never know when something's going to get rediscovered.
Right.
And I think that's kind of the key. If you can maintain that steady growth, and again, fashion is obviously such a challenging category, but and then look for those halo moments. You just never know when that lightning's going to strike or that person is going to decide to wear that object of clothing on a video or an album cover. But it's a hard one. I don't know. I think back to Tommy Hilfiger, way back when there was when George Lois sort of gave them that really brave move where it said that there's 5 top designers in the U.S. and one of them you've never heard of. And it's really interesting that Tommy Hilfiger has kind of over really those 40 years kind of ridden a really interesting wave.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously brand owners and in particular company owners, whether they're private, public, or PE firms, right, all want to be able to control the destiny, right? And so serendipity is great, right? If you happen to be lucky enough. But these days with influencer marketing as well as gifting, whether that gifting occurs in the Oscar bag or somewhere else, right? You'd love to be able to become the catalyst, right? Strike the match that starts that. Do you feel like brands have an opportunity to use influencer marketing and change their own destiny that way, or do you feel like it's more likely to be random?
I think both for sure. I think sophisticated influencer marketing, it's just, it's real. There's no getting away from it because of the social channels. And, I think obviously it's evolved over the last 10 years in massive ways, and there's all sorts of types of influencers. But I think when you look at how brands have allowed others to participate with the brand and make it their own, I think that's what's really powerful. As long as everybody kind of feels like they know what that center is, even if it's a little flexible, the brands that are really doing well are creating these networks of people and owners. And the network in and of itself, I don't know that you would call them influencers, but I think they really ultimately are, because that network becomes the value of the brand. And when you can kind of create that, and you look at network influencers and network brands from Google and Alibaba, Instagram, obviously. And, I think one of the ones that's really fun to watch right now, especially at the end of the year, is Spotify. It's the network that they've created is really creating the value for the brand, and they are all influencing each other with their playlists, with the way that they share the product. And Spotify's brilliant at giving everybody the tools to spread the word, but through a personal lens. And I think that's really powerful. And that is influence.
Right. That's an excellent point. Certainly folks at agencies and sometimes folks who are client side, right? They think about brands that they're, you build it through the building blocks of visual and audio and messaging and packaging. And then you think about the brand experience and factor that in. But in the end, brands are built emotionally, right? So, how do you catch that how do you catch that emotional side? Because all those things just seem like tools in a toolbox, right? And that doesn't get you where you need to go. You need to figure out how to get it all to work in perfect unison to deliver emotional response. And so you've been in design and in branding for so long. I'm sort of wondering, like, is there a process there, or is it serendipity? Is it inspiration, right, that drives that?
I love the question because, I'm a big fan of getting the foundation right. We sort of alluded to it. It's kind of like, having your desk very neat and tidy in order to get wild with your ideas. And I think sometimes for me, it's really thinking about what you mean by that word emotional. Because I think what that word means today, sometimes it can be very different. It can really be based in what that experience is. Sometimes it can be based in what communication is. I don't think there's one answer, but I think what I love to do is really balance interesting and right. It's sort of a journalistic model. I'd rather be interesting than right, but I need a little bit of both.
Yeah.
And so I want to make sure I'm not so right that I'm boring, that I'm too pragmatic. But
Right.
I think every brand has their version of what interesting is. Because I can take a brand, Nike's a really great example because of the way they've become a really powerful direct-to-consumer brand. And they don't use traditional channels. They do a lot of experiential, they do a lot of content and heavy digital, but not a lot of traditional media, not a lot of TV commercials, if any, anymore, videos that are very emotional. But they find that really great balance. They're very pragmatic. They're really tight when it comes to their direct-to-consumer model. If you spend time on the Nike app, it's very emotional. I don't think people in the traditional sense would say this is very emotional, but it is a really kind of interesting experience. And if you just bring in enough of the videos that they do and enough of those cultural moments, it's kind of an interesting model that they have. But I think that balance of interesting and right is really the key. And interesting is not always wild and crazy. Sometimes I would say, like even in Chipotle's world, it's just a kick-ass digital experience. And look what that's done for that brand. It's emotional in its usefulness, if you'll allow me to combine those two words.
Sure. We can combine those together. The other thing I wanted to get into is back 20 years ago, more than actually 20, almost 30 years ago, actually, when I was at McCann Erickson and J. Walter Thompson, a lot of brand owners, had this very much command and control mentality. Like, we have to have a command and control mentality around messaging. But now it seems to be that brands and companies not only are empowering their entire staff to live the brand and potentially tweak, the way they live the brand, but also obviously empower the consumer to live the brand and communicate that out through social media. So command and control doesn't really work very well in that construct. But yet folks who've been, trained under this command and control model, how can they let go, right? How can they sort of allow the interesting to happen outside of their checkbox, right? To where the interesting happened on its own, and you didn't necessarily control the interesting.
It's a great question. I think what's really helpful for me is I try, and we do this just very proactively. The more you live inside your own construct and that control construct, even inside your own building, your own team, the more it is going to feel controlled. It's going to feel stayed, and you're gonna miss out on anything interesting. But you really have to understand and live in the world where your consumer lives, and really put your feet in their shoes. And all of a sudden, things become less precious for one.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to experiment a lot more. And I think one of the fundamental things that really helps me is when I think of a brand more as a set of actions and more as a verb than I do a noun. I think of it less as a resource and something that I invest in, versus something that just does and it lives out in the world. That frees up so much of my thinking. And I think part of the challenge with that command and control model is a lot of organizations think of the brand as an asset. They think of it as something that you put money into or you don't put money into, you invest in or you don't invest in. And nothing makes me cringe more when I hear people say, well, we need to do more brand advertising and less performance. I'm like, by the way, everything you do is your brand. Whether you call it brand advertising or performance, it is brand. And I think that the world that's out there, consumers, they don't see the difference. If all you're doing is performance advertising, that's how they see your brand. They see it as a transactional brand. They see it as a very pragmatic brand. And guess what? For some, that might work in the short term, but it's not going to work in the long term. Just ask Airbnb. They totally flipped their model and it basically saved their business. They had turned into a performance marketing company and almost killed them.
That's a great point. I'd read I think it maybe was your blog or somewhere about this idea center construct. I'd love you to explain what that is.
Yeah, we have a really interesting model. So we began as more of a traditional advertising agency, but over the years, we started to realize that our job is to help brands be successful. Sometimes that's advertising, sometimes that's marketing, but in the world that we live in, there's so many reasons why people choose your brand or not. And it's not just advertising. So we started to look at a spectrum of ideas and applications, and that really runs the gamut. You'll see me do this a lot, really. I live in the spectrum, but it's really from advertising on one end to sustainability on the other end. And in between are things like design and experience, product innovation, content, PR, and culture. So that is where we really bring ideas across that spectrum. So we are organized in these idea centers because we feel that we can bring creativity across a wide range of things. And some of it's really altitude. So we have one idea area we call strategy and transformation. So we call that idea area strategy and transformation. So that's really designed to be our upstream thinking. A lot of times that will develop culture, sustainability ideas, business models. We've created many brands from scratch. And then design and experience is a big one. We separate those two words out, but design with a capital D is really everything that the organization does, and experience specifically can run, through the lens of customer experience, physical experience. And then communication and activation is really kind of what traditionally has been our bread and butter, but that's where advertising and PR and media live. And we feel like having that grouping has really been powerful, and it allows us to, I think, behave and succeed in very murky areas, which is what we find ourselves in a lot, especially when we're looking at helping brands be successful. Sometimes it's an experience idea. Sometimes it's an internal culture idea, and sometimes it's advertising. A lot of times it's a combination of all of the above. And so we're very nimble, and we've really created this model that allows that to happen, which I love. It's one of the biggest things I love about our organization.
Yeah, that's great that you evolved in that way. We evolved similarly at Did It. It's interesting that catalysts were very different in the way in which we evolved there, because we started in SEO in 96, 26 years ago, and SEO was always very content centric, right? So content remained core, even as we moved into paid advertising, because the ability for paid advertising to work well related to the content being appropriate, on the landing page or within the app or whatever. And so, content sort of remained foundational. But as SEO evolved, like a lot of external elements ended up driving SEO, right? SEO no longer lived in a silo. So whether it was content marketing, PR, digital PR, industry relations, content co-creation, even branded content and influencer marketing, like all those things ended up impacting each other, right? And the way we ended up having to solve it was make 11 small acquisitions, including 3 PR agencies, right? Because initially I was like, well, in order to solve this problem, we need the other subject matter expertise. And I didn't want to always have a freelancer, come in and become that subject matter expert. So that was how we ended up solving it and becoming more holistic, even though many folks still think about us as a search marketing agency, and paid and organic search are still slightly over 50% of our fee revenue. We've had to branch out into this sort of holistic model, but we just came at it via a different sort of problem solution mindset as opposed to sort of the way you came at it, which was sort of starting holistic, right? So it's interesting that we got to a similar place. I'd love to, talk a little bit more about sort of the ideation around, new brands and brand extensions, and then brands going through either an evolution or potentially in some cases a revolution. And because the ideation is sort of at the center of a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've been doing this for a long time, and I tell people all the time, I've never been more excited about what's happening right now. And I guess one of the things that excites me is I think this is a great moment to look at the entire brand as the canvas. When I first got in the business, I was gung-ho about making ads and commercials, and those executions were exciting. But over time, and it happened pretty quickly, even for me early in my career, I started to see that creativity can happen in a lot of different places, and it's not just the ads. Now, obviously, with social media, that exploded everything, but we're also just seeing the idea that creativity across that entire brand is really exciting. And that is what I look for. I look for people that want to build a brand, and at the end of the day, look at the entire brand as that work of art. And so you can imagine stepping back with Patagonia and thinking of all the things that you know about Patagonia, all the things they do internally and externally. Now imagine what that looks like on that canvas. That's a pretty beautiful thing to create. Now, that would be very holistic in my terms. We use the term whole brand, but imagine a brand that isn't so holistic, and you step back and you look at it and it looks like little fragments, little pieces of things, maybe some shiny objects. And to me, not only is that not interesting, that's not where brands are going. So I think this holistic idea of thinking, can we apply creativity and originality to everything we do, not just some of the things that we do? I think that's where you're going to see brands really, really winning. I think it's already happening. Even brands that have it so well honed that they don't need to spend a lot on advertising. Look at Costco, look at Trader Joe's, look at brand Tesla, obviously, that are leading their market and spending very little on advertising because they are doing so many other things very well. They're using their word of mouth, they're using social channels, and their strong, passionate customer base to drive the business. But I love the idea of looking at the whole brand as the palette and the thing to be creative on versus just parts and pieces. And I think that's where things are going. And that's honestly, that's what's exciting about this business right now.
Yeah, what I love about your previous answer is so often people with sort of a bean counter mentality might be like, oh, I just need to throw money at this, right, to solve that problem, right? And your examples of brands that have been able to thrive and become market leaders in their categories without throwing barely any money at it, right, really is the counterpoint, right? That if you sort of start with the core of the brand, you may not have to throw nearly as much money at it, right? If you can sort of do it sort of from the inside out. So, if someone comes to you and they're like, that's our aspiration, right? I need to refresh the brand, rediscover our purpose, and take that journey to where the dollars I spend are more efficient because the rest of the surrounding foundation is strong, right? How do you take people through that journey? Because that sounds like a lot more than what a traditional agency would do.
It is. And I think what we've done in order to have credibility on that journey, we look at, basically taking this hypothesis that the whole brand is stronger than the brand as marketing. So, really it's flipping that paradigm. Brand is on top. Marketing is a subset of brand, not the other way around. I think that as soon as you understand that, all sorts of things open up. So what we do is we look holistically at all of those areas that make up the brand inside and out, the way we look at it. And we measure it through that whole brand's, what we call a whole brand index, where we can actually measure and give people different priorities. So for instance, design might be lacking, and design is a huge driver of business. And so that might be an area that we feel like we need to overcommit to or spend more money on. And I think with the brands that we talked about, they're not necessarily not throwing money at things. They're probably not throwing money in the sense of more marketing, more advertising will turn this thing around. They're using the same amount of money. They're just using it differently. They're using it places that really pay dividends. So that's really what we do. We measure the whole brand. We have a whole brand index. And every year we actually do a customer survey, consumer survey of over 5,000 consumers. And we look at approximately 160 to 180 brands to see which ones are behaving better. And it really turns out that the brands that are more holistic are outperforming their fragmented counterparts, as we call it, by really substantial margins. So we bring that mentality into this measurement system and look holistically and start making recommendations on where people should invest their money. And sometimes it does mean pulling the rubber band all the way back to purpose and getting those foundational pieces right, and giving yourself enough of a powerful umbrella for moving forward. And I think that's sometimes in purpose, it's sometimes in a big communication idea, but usually that ends up driving every piece of the business. And that's what we look for. And so I think the credibility is really in us doing the research. That helps us walk in and look holistically. And one of the things that we've done is, as we've built talent, one of the things we really look for is what we call a navigator. And so a navigator is really, in a way, I would call it our consultant model, but a navigator is really someone that can look at that whole brand and see where the opportunities are and where the challenges are, and then apply creative ideas accordingly, I should say.
Great. Final question is, so what is the role of this navigator or your team when somebody comes to you with a startup that has yet to define the brand, right? Because it's one thing to go in there and sort of rediscover purpose within the existing brand or build on that framework. But when the whiteboard is empty, right? How does that process change?
It's obviously it's one of the most exciting things that we can do. We've built, let's see, I think we're on 4 different brands that we've built from scratch. So we weren't just meeting them at the startup place, we were helping them create the startup. And what's beautiful about it is you get to bring those core foundational ideas and apply them to the experience and to the business model. We've helped develop physical locations. We've even chosen things like the pillows that go on the couches, which is always my best example of, can you take that core idea or that brand purpose and have it be a filter or a guide for what those pillows on the couch should be? So we really take our model and we build it out holistically. And one of the best things that we do is really make sure that we're working not just with a small team on the foundation team, but really as many stakeholders on the brand side as we can, as well as consumers. So we build these really deep, holistic stakeholder teams as we're building it, but we run the same process. We look for that core idea, that purpose, and then we look at the whole brand in order to use creativity for the experience, for the product, for the identity. And then if we get to marketing, how they're going to go to market. So it's the same process. It's just getting up there earlier and, having a founder's mentality, which is, I wish we could have that in every situation, but it's been really fun. We're hoping to do more of that type of work because it's really the best way to experience our model.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Tim. It was a pleasure brainstorming with you about brands and purpose and creativity, and how you've changed how you approach it over the years.
Thank you for the invitation, and thanks for the great questions.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.